Hey, what's up guys? Hello, Footballtalk here, back with another off-season topic, this time focusing on some of the position battles to look out for as players get back onto the field in preparation of the 2021 NFL season. With training camp for all 32 teams now underway, I thought it was time to go through every single roster once again and identify what I believe are some of the key position battles for starting spots primarily. In this exercise, we're looking for true competitions, not just me talking about some random rookies that I actually really liked in the draft process, who could impress when they get the chance to, but rather those ones that I believe have a chance to go down to the wire, with even preseason games in some cases being needed to decide who the coaches will put out there. I tried to include one example for each position without repeating teams, and at the end I will mention a few other competitions that I will have my eyes on. As always, the link to my page, hellosfootballtalk.com, is down below in the description, where I broke down some of the biggest breakout candidates for 2021 in a detailed 2-part series, so make sure to check that out if you're interested. And you can also find all my social media handles below this video if you want to stay up to date with all the stuff that I post, get some extra content, or just read some of my random thoughts. But now let's get this thing started with the most key position of all, quarterbacks. More specifically, what we will see in Denver. And I know, it's not Aaron Rodgers, and we can't eliminate that possibility as of this moment, at least when I'm recording this. But right now, these are the candidates to start in the center for a team in the Broncos that I don't think many people realize how loaded that roster truly is. The offensive line has seen steady improvement. They now have two bangers out of the backfield who can both catch the ball or protect well, and a group of young receivers that offers a ton of firepower. So whoever does the action in Denver has all the pieces to put up some big numbers, I believe. So to me, and probably the Broncos, if they are truly honest with themselves at least, the preferred option here is third-year quarterback Drew Lock. Things didn't go as expected in year 2, as I myself talked a lot about all the weapons that this offense featured, and even the breakdown of Lock's qualities that I thought could set him up for a breakout year, after he won 4 of the 5 games that he was the starter for as a rookie, and definitely showed some signs. I don't think you can say that he didn't have flashes in 2020, but he was over-aggressive on too many occasions, made some questionable decisions, and wasn't careful with the ball in general. That's somewhat understandable for a young player, but you didn't see much improvement throughout the season. With that being said, his top wide receiver Courtland Sutton missed pretty much the whole year, Jerry Jeudy had his drop issues, tight end Noah Fant missed some time, and Locke was banged up himself. With a defensive mind like Vic Fangio making the final decision, being tied with Carson Wentz with 15 interceptions, and Highmark for fumbles with 8, has put him on the short leash, I would say, but the talent with Locke is clearly there, with a very strong arm, the ability to attack all areas of the field whilst being on the move, and a certain swagger that he brings to the table when he's on point at least. With that roster around him, it's now or never for him though, I believe. The obvious challenger here is Teddy Bridgewater, who the Broncos traded a 6th-round pick for a day before the draft to secure themselves a veteran along the still shaky Locke. Bridgewater is somebody that is easy to root for, because he seems to be a great guy to have around in the organization, and he has shown a lot of fight to get back from the gruesome leg injury. But as a starting quarterback, he has kind of been a tease, I would say. As a late first-round pick from Minnesota back in 2014, he looked like the long-term option for the Vikings potentially, even though I've probably never seen a quarterback do less for a playoff team than him in his first full season as a starter. Then he's out almost 2 years with that recovery. The Vikings move on from all the quarterbacks on the roster in favor of Kirk Cousins. Teddy goes to New Orleans to back up Drew Brees. And in 2019, he actually goes 5-0 as a starter in relief duty, once again with very little responsibility at his hands, I would say, which earned him a 3-year, $63 million deal with the Carolina Panthers inside the division. Then last year, he starts off pretty strong, keeps a Panthers squad that is still building in most games that they were in, but then they go on to lose 9 of the final 10 games, with the last one being his worst, as he couldn't move the ball against that Saints team who really had nothing to play for. I still believe that he really limits what you can do offensively, but he was pretty successful in Joe Brady's spread offense, working for the underneath passing game and defeating defensive leverage and stuff like that, but he simply doesn't offer much of a vertical component or playmaking off schedule, unless he takes off himself. However, he has protected the ball well for the majority of his career, and could be appealing to a coaching staff that needs to win now as kind of the safer option. I had to mention Brett Rypien here, because he was one of my personal favorites to watch on tape at Boise State, but this should be a 2-man race, where I really believe it'll be close to 50-50 with who will line up on the center in the season opener. With that being said, I can remember right there in Denver back in 2016 when the Broncos had first round pick Paxton Lynch and veteran Mark Sanchez on that roster, and it was Trevor Siemian actually starting every single game that season. I've been a fan of Ripien since I validated his college tape and didn't want to just not talk about him at all, because that guy can make some plays. Either way, this might come down all the way to preseason week 3, and the start is probably not safe against a couple of bad performances in season either. That takes us to the second group, and we're going to talk about the Chicago Bears' number 2 running back. David Montgomery has clearly established himself as the featured early down back at the very least, with a physical running style and better elusiveness than his size might indicate. I had him as a breakout candidate ahead of the 2020 season, and he really picked things up over the second half of the year. Now the question is who will be behind him and or eat into some of that workload that he had. Tariq Cohen, coming back from injury, as he got hurt 3 games into this past season against Atlanta, with very little production up to that point. We think of Cohen as this super dynamic space player, going back to his time as North Carolina A&T, where he was nicknamed the human joystick, and he has all those qualities, but it was mind-boggling to see in 2019 when he was targeted more than 100 times and averaged just 5.8 yards per catch to go with 3.3 yards per carry. Now, that certainly has a lot to do with that stagnant Bears offense, but I never looked at Cohen as anything more than a scat back and designated pass catcher. Still, Matt Nagy seems to be a fan of his and has found ways to get him on the field a lot, plus he offers some punt return upside as well, so either way he's gonna have his role, but not totally sure if it's gonna be as a true RB2. Then we have somebody who didn't play at all last season, in Damian Williams. He's kind of the forgotten man in this backfield. I think if you ask like 90% of fans, they don't even know that he's in Chicago right now. But let's not forget when last seen, Williams could or arguably should have been the Super Bowl MVP with that game-sealing breakaway run against the 49ers as the lasting image. And he brings a certain speed element that I don't think even Cohen has, despite being like 30 pounds heavier and now 29 years old. In 2019, he just cracked the 1,000 scrimmage yard in 14 games, including the playoffs, and became the featured option for Kansas City down the stretch before opting out this past season. Sure, he's at an advanced stage for a running back and has never been a number 1 for a full year even, but he's really a multi-purpose option with plenty of experience in a similarly based offensive system and no major weakness, I would say. And then there's the rookie, Khalil Herbert, who was my 10th ranked running back in this year's draft, but the Bears were able to steal him in the 6th round due to not breaking out until his 5th year in college, and maybe not offering an elite quality necessarily. However, I believe he's a great fit for this offense that uses so much of the zone run game with the splits and boots off it, to where his ability to press the front side and then get vertical in one fluid motion while having excellent vision to see lanes open up should translate very well. He can get skinny through the hole, is efficient with his footwork, and has better contact balance that he gets credit for. He's not super explosive and unproven at this point in the pass game, but I believe he could be a long-term second punch behind Monty, or maybe even replace him officially if they don't want to pay the number 1. So this is certainly a tough one. To be honest, I would probably think that Damian gets the second most carries this year, while Cohen will lead that group in receptions once again, is more of a gadget player / slot receiver. But as the year goes along, I could see Herbert getting more and more involved, and depending on how quickly he can establish himself as a 3-down back, look like a key part to this offense as we project him forward to the future. The third position today is the Arizona Cardinals slot receiver. So before we get into this one, I'm working under the assumption that Larry Fitzgerald will be retired by week 1. Not that I have any inside knowledge of the situation, but to be in August almost, and not know if a player will come back, especially for what will be a 38-year-old wide receiver at that point, I have to treat this as if he wasn't part of the roster, because there is no active contract for him currently. So instead I'm looking at 2 young second-round picks, looking to battle it out, with the first one being Christian Kirk. Due to the presence of Fitzgerald, Kirk only spent 85 snaps in the slot this past season, but now with AJ Green, who has actually had pretty good success a few times that he was utilized in the slot, but is more of an outside receiver by nature, and fits more of that mold in the Cardinals offense, I would expect Kirk to complete the snaps in the slot primarily. That's also where he made a name for himself at Texas A&M, to go with some electric punt returns, and even though he was drafted before Cliff Kingsbury got there, he can take a lot of responsibilities in that arid offense, whether it's replacing a linebacker with a glance or slant route on the backside of an RPO play, or getting free on crosses off their mesh concepts, where he has the burst to run away from the pursuit, but he also offers a more vertical component from that spot, with more possession type of receivers on the outside. While having been in that offense long enough to understand some of the subtleties of adjusting routes on the fly, rookie Rondale Moore might not have that experience, but my lord, he's even more dynamic. Going back to his freshman tape from 2018, this guy looked like an absolute superstar in the making, especially having watched him torture that Ohio State defense that was loaded with NFL talent, and allowing Purdue to defeat the big bad wolf of the Big Ten that day. Unfortunately, he would rarely be 100% healthy for the following 2 seasons, and then last year especially, caught the ball at or behind the line of scrimmage about as many times as beyond it. And that makes sense considering how little that offense inspired confidence, because Moore has that ridiculous explosiveness to create big plays anyway, but it took away some of the stuff that he can do down the field. Now, he's only 5'7", with a minuscule catch radius, but he has such a strong lower body to break tackles, and I don't see why a dynamic player like that can succeed in a space-oriented offense in today's NFL. I'm not going to entertain the idea of Andy Isabella playing any significant snaps for this team, because he simply hasn't, since funnily enough being a second-round pick for Arizona back in 2019. Not saying that I loved what I saw from a broken-down AJ Green last season either, who struggled mightily to create any type of separation, but he's a big enough name and can do things with body adjustments just like DeAndre Hopkins on the other side to guarantee himself some playing time, so Kirk and Moore are really the only ones to battle it out for the slot. And this brings an interesting dynamic, as Kirk is on the last year of his rookie contract, and we'll see if they want to keep him as part of that young core in Arizona. I personally believe that he will start for most of the year, simply because he's more familiar with that offense, but Moore could rip off some big punt returns and explosives on designated touches, which will intrigue Kingsbury to get the ball in his hands even more. We stay in the NFC West, talking about the Seattle Seahawks in a tight end situation. To me, the tight end position for the Seahawks has always been a bit of an odd one. Other than Greg Olsen in year 14 on his way to retirement, they haven't had any players of name there, but somehow those guys have always caught key passes from Russell Wilson, and he has built up some pretty good connections throughout the years. This year, there's 3 very different candidates vying for that starting job. A guy who has been productive in that offense, but hasn't really been able to stay healthy. So under the radar free agency signing, and the day 3 draft pick from a year ago, whose skill set I believe matches up well with what the Seattle quarterback likes. First we have Will Dissly, who was a 4th round pick for the Seahawks in 2018. He only appeared in 10 games through his first 2 years, and when he did play a full 16 games late last year, Olsen did eat into his targets, and he was banged up again for stretches. So he has now started 22 of 26 games played, catching 55 passes for 669 yards and 8 touchdowns. As a converted defensive end, Dissly's appeal coming out of Washington was his physicality as a blocker, which you can still see, but he also quickly was able to establish some chemistry with Russ as a receiver, when available at least. He offers a big frame and dependable hands, with only 1 career drop so far. Last year he was relegated to a lot more underneath work on drag routes and slips into the flats, as two-thirds of his receiving yards came after the catch. Now with Olsen off the radar, there's more targets available down the seams and on deeper crossers, where Dissly's ability to shield the ball and win through contact could play out more. Unfortunately for him, he will have to compete with Seattle's free agency addition from a division rival in the Rams, as Gerald Everett has more of a big slot receiver build and doesn't offer the same power as a blocker at the point of attack, but he's a more dynamic yak threat and brings more of a speed element as a downfield option. In Los Angeles, he was heavily used working across the flow of the play on the Rams' bootlegs, where he could make linebackers pay for overrunning stuff, and then had that juice to clear the second wave of the defense as they try to redirect. That skill set was also used in the screen game to go with a few clean releases down the numbers from a wing alignment. He may not bring them the same as a +1 in protection as Dissly, which is definitely one of his strengths, but he can execute those sift blocks off play action, or guide edge rushers along the arc of deeper play action, to go with being a threat when releasing late. So he offers some intriguing stuff as more of an H-back option probably. And then we have Colby Parkinson, one of my personal favorites in the 2020 draft process. He's not somebody who will create a lot of separation, and it was kind of weird how Stanford truly used him, as he was actually put out wide a lot, but at the same time, he does have plenty of experience being in line and executing a pro-style rushing attack. You won't see him split too high safety looks necessarily, but if he has somebody trailing him down the middle, he's great at adjusting to back shoulder balls as well as using a 6'7" frame in the red zone. His 15 contested catches in 2019 led all draft-eligible tight ends, and if you're somewhat familiar with what Russell Wilson liked from the tight end position, tell me this bit that I wrote about him last year heading into the draft doesn't hit the nail on the head. Parkinson's combination of size, ball skills, and feel for the position are excellent, plus he tested better than I expected him to. He could be a great target for a quarterback who can win with ball placement on the short and intermediate level. Like, that's right on point. As a rookie, he only played 51 offensive snaps and caught 2 passes, however, so he has a long way to go. Before the draft, I could have easily seen the Seahawks use a lot more 12 personnel in 2021, with the loss of David Moore in free agency and Pete Carroll's unwavering commitment to the run game. But by using their top draft pick and Western Michigan's wide receiver, Dwayne Eskridge, I think they have even more reason to have 3 wide receivers on the field, because that guy offers a more dynamic quality in the slot even. So my idea of Disley is more of your typical Y, and Everett playing off the ball primarily when both are at the field at the same time will at least be less than I thought it could be. Still, I believe both will play close to half the snaps, and Parkinson could have a role as well in certain packages, especially in the red zone. Now let's look at the offensive line and switch conferences as we look at the Pittsburgh Steelers right tackle. I have discussed the amount of personnel losses that the Steelers have suffered this offseason on multiple occasions, and while they did just address the outside linebacker position with a bargain signing Melvin Ingram, the offensive line still needs to replace at least 3 starters from a year ago, with second-year guard Kevin Dotson being the only returning piece potentially who will start at the same spot after an impressive showing once he has inserted. A third-round pick from 3 years ago in Chukwuma Okorafor, who I actually really liked as a draft prospect, is expected to switch sides and replace Alejandro Villanueva at left tackle, but I don't think the right side is really settled yet. Zach Banner was the intended starter last year, as they decided to plug him in and move Matt Fowler to guard instead. Unfortunately, that didn't even last a full game, as he tore his ACL in the season opener. It was kind of surprising to me that he was named a starter in the first place, having logged just 1 start before then, since coming into the league in 2017. So while it would seem Pittsburgh likes what he has shown them in practice, this is still somewhat of a projection in terms of what he will provide as a now 17-game starter, especially coming off knee surgery. He's a big guy who can create push and combo blocks, and has pretty surprising lateral mobility in the zone run game, but his hand placement, weight distribution with his lower body are off to me in pass protection. He's probably the front runner still, but there's certainly more pressure on him now. The guy with the most experience of the bunch is actually free agency addition Joe Haeg, who started all but 4 of the 39 games played through 3 years in Indianapolis, before being moved to the bench and then losing the competition in Tampa Bay last year, with Tristan Wirfs putting together one of the all-time great rookie offensive tackle seasons. Since being drafted in 2016, Haeg has always been a serviceable player, but the Colts were actually looking to replace him 2 years in, and there are some athletic limitations I would say. I think if he has to fill in, he can be a solid player at either guard spot and especially right tackle, but you'd like to have him as your backup and swing tackle, which the Bucs used him quite a bit as, with all the heavy play action packages, although he most famously dropped a touchdown in the Super Bowl most recently. And then again, we have a rookie to discuss. Dan Moore Jr. was the Steelers' 4th round pick out of Texas A&M this year, and he to me is kind of a Joe Haeg plus, I would call it, where he has some more upside, but to me will never be a franchise tackle necessarily. He's not somebody who will drive guys off the ball at the point of attack, or impress with his ability to perfectly mirror twitchy pass rushers, but he does well to sustain blocks, which is most important for all those inside zone runs that Pittsburgh wants to run. And he understands how to guide rushers past the arc to the quarterback to not allow those guys to actually get home. Once again, nothing super exciting, but I believe he can be a solid player from day 1 and beyond if he's out there. So ultimately, like I already said, this is probably still Banner's job to lose if the coaching staff likes him as much as I think they do, but Moore could push him, especially if he's not totally up to speed with his recovery yet, even though that shouldn't be much of an issue, now basically a full calendar year away from the injury. And Haeg to me is probably more a flexible 6th offensive lineman who can fill in for multiple spots if the stars get hurt. Staying on the offensive line, but switching to the AFC West, with the Kansas City Chiefs in the center situation, if there's one team that made it their biggest priority to address one specific area of the football team, it's the Chiefs completely overhauling the offensive line. They should have at least 3 new starters compared to the 2020 season, and they could have up to 5 even. To do so, they used all possible paths, trading the 1st round pick for Orlando Brown from Baltimore, signing the top guard on the open market in Joe Thuney, drafting somebody that I'll get to in a moment in the 2nd round, and even bringing back retired players. The one spot that I think is most up for grabs is center, however, where they have at least two equally logical options, I believe. First, there's the guy who has started for Kansas City each of the last 2 years in Austin Reiter. For an offensive line that was in flux for all of last season, it felt like, he was the one constant right at the pivot. That wasn't the case for him to begin his career, as he started just one game and immediately suffered a season-ending ACL tear before coming to Kansas City in 2018. Reiter has never been the most powerful drive blocker necessarily, flirting with that 300-pound mark throughout his career, and you saw it last season as well early on, when he was working on double teams with a guy like Kelechi Osemele, who could really create some movement, and then that element missing the rest of the year, I would say. He does have very good mobility to get hands on people in space as part of the jet sweep packages and screen game. In the pass game, he's very good with landing his hands first and controlling reps, even though he may not have the strongest anchor to swallow bull rushes necessarily, but they do rarely leave him totally one-on-one with a lot of half-line slides. Reiter will have his hands full, however, fighting off 63rd overall pick Creed Humphrey. With Alabama's Landon Dickerson having those injury concerns, he was a little further down in my rankings, and this guy was my number 1 ranked interior offensive lineman in the draft. In 3 years at Oklahoma, Humphrey started every single game and was the Big 12 Offensive Lineman of the Year in each of the last 2. I was surprised to see him fall this far in the actual draft, and still think his skill set should directly translate to the next level. The Chiefs do work with a lot of angles in the run game, especially when they get closer to the goal line, where Creed's smarts for the position can shine, but he's not necessarily going to uproot guys out of the gaps either. What he excels at is executing reach and seal-off blocks, using his powerful claws and efficient footwork to put his body in the way of pursuit defenders and allowing the ball carrier to get outside of him. Plus, thanks to his wrestling background, he's almost impossible to move straight back, because he will reset his base and grab turf with his cleats to slow down big nose tackles even. The third guy I wanted to mention here is a name that probably almost nobody will recognize, even though I feel like it's a very generic one, especially with one of his teammates having the exact same one, with an E instead of the Y in the name, in running back Darrell Williams, and I think this guy is more so trying to just secure a roster spot, and that's Darrell Williams with the Y. I had him as my 9th ranked interior offensive lineman in the 2020 draft, but he ended up going undrafted and spent last year in Kansas City's practice squad. He presents kind of a similar skill set to those other 2 guys, in terms of the ability to move in space, but there are some strength limitations. I thought he was a good enough player to at least mention here. So I really believe the Chiefs have one of the top center trios potentially this upcoming season. With Joe Thuney pretty much guaranteed to start at left guard, it will come down to how they want to put together the right side of the offensive line. I personally believe that Creed's most natural fit is at center, and he will be the best option there. But then Wright and Williams are still competing for right guard, with Lauren Duvernay-Tardif coming back from his opt-out, and recently unretired Carl Long, who both could be in the running for the right tackle gig as well, if Mike Remmers continues to struggle. And with this, we're switching to the defensive side of the ball, starting with the Indianapolis Colts and their legal defensive end. The Indianapolis Colts emerged last season as a top 10 defense under coordinator Matt Eberflus, who they were lucky to retain for another year as a hot name in the coaching circle. Personnel-wise, they all have a looking to make some changes, especially at defensive end. Justin Houston, Denico Autry, and Al-Kahin Muhammad all played between 56 and 61% of the defensive snaps for the Colts this past season, and none of those guys is still on the roster. They spent the first 2 picks of the draft theoretically looking to address that, and the top selection, Kwity Paye from Michigan, should start on the strong side on early downs at least, with his ability to set a physical edge in the run game. But second rounder Deo Odeyingbo will probably miss the entire season with a torn Achilles, and they aren't really settled on the opposite edge, which I tagged as the Leo defensive end in the even front, as the guy is going to be more on the weak side, and we are looking at 3 more second round picks to step into that role. Tyquan Lewis and Kemoko Turay were both taken within 10 selections in 2018. Lewis has been the more steady contributor for this group, as a fairly complete defensive end who will hold his contain in the run game, and did record 8 tackles for loss this past season as a rotational piece for this defense to go along with 4 sacks. But with 32 total pressures and close to 1,000 career snaps, he hasn't been a difference maker on passing downs necessarily. Still, he would be the most logical option to directly step into a starting role, having played his part in all 16 games this last year. Turay, on the other hand, has had brighter flashes, going back to his rookie year, and I thought he was one of the prime candidates for a breakout season after that, but he simply hasn't been able to stay healthy, unfortunately, appearing in just 11 combined games this past 2 seasons, and being banged up even when he was officially active, logging only 176 snaps across those, as he suffered a dislocated ankle in 2019, had some issues with his recovery due to the COVID restrictions, and was still bothered throughout this past season with it. When healthy, I really liked his burst off the edge, that unique athletic skill set that he brings to the table, and what he can do on different twists. It's been a while since we've seen him show that off, but if given a chance to prove himself as a rusher, he could remind that coaching staff of the talent level that he has. And then a year after Indy brought in Lewis and Teray, they once again invested into the position with a lighter player that probably brings a more specialized set of tools in Ben Banogu. I personally thought the eventual first-round pick LJ Collier was better suited for an every-down player in the league, even though he hasn't really panned out for the Seahawks at this point either. Banogu came to the 2019 Combine slightly below 250 pounds, but just jumped out of the gym, showcasing that explosive lower body that he has, which I thought could make him a passing down specialist. He has yet to start a game for Indy, and that may remain that way, but he at least did show some signs as a rookie, with 2.5 sacks and 8 more additional pressures on about a quarter of the snaps. Last year he unfortunately only appeared in 9 games, playing 10% of snaps and barely getting on a stat sheet. But he can stress tackles with his get-off, has good short area quicks to kind of freeze them, and then impressive closing burst to the quarterback. There's just a lot of bodies that he'll have to beat out. I would think Lewis is the favorite to earn a starting job in this defense, but I would love to see Teray bounce back and continue on the path that he seemed to be poised for following his debut campaign. Injuries just have been too big a part of his football career, going back to his time at Rutgers as well. Banogu to me neither had the build to become a free-down player in the pros, and doesn't feature the body type that can add much weight without losing the appealing, explosive traits that he brings. He could however be a productive player on longer downs for them, as I expect him to rotate guys through a ton. We stay inside the AFC South in terms of the division, but move slightly inside position-wise with the Jacksonville Jaguars 3-technique defensive tackle. It has been a very eventful offseason for Jacksonville. After shocking the division rival Colts in the season opener last year, they've lost 15 straight games and completely overhauled their regime, with Urban Meyer taking over control of this franchise, bringing in what is widely accepted as a generational quarterback prospect in Trevor Lawrence, and using a bunch of resources to fill the rest of the roster. One area that they clearly made a priority to address is the depth on the interior defensive line, with a couple of pieces still there, but who will start for them now? Last year's third-round pick Devon Hamilton seems to be a logical option at the nose, while I would still expect him to run an even front primarily, and new defensive coordinator Joe Cullen bringing over his hybrid principle from Baltimore, meaning in theory the open spot would be the 3-technique, so the defensive tackle shaded to the outside shoulder of the guard. Still the most talented player of the bunch, in my opinion, is 2018 first-round pick Taven Bryan, who I personally thought had some J.J. Watt to him, with his first step off the ball, the ability to slice through gaps or backdoor blockers with quickness. There was a lot to like about his tape at Florida. However, he has never lived up to his draft status, with some Jags fans being bitter until this offseason, when they knew they actually had Trevor Lawrence in the bag, since they passed up the opportunity to draft Lamar Jackson for Bryan. He's not been a bad player, not missing a single game of his career, with 10 total pressures and 8 tackles for loss over his last 2 seasons, playing 46% of the snaps each, but not what we would hope for based on his draft position. Bryan at his best as a chaos player, just shooting through gaps and forcing offenses to get off schedule, but unfortunately he doesn't seem to quite bring the same type of energy every single snap, and he has to bring more control chaos to the table, where he puts himself into position to actually create negative plays. His 50 option has already been declined, meaning he would become a free agent after the season. The question is if the new regime wants to see what he can do still in this new system, or if they want to give some of the other players more time to develop. Malcolm Brown isn't necessarily a young player for Jacksonville, even though he actually is only 27 years old himself, now on his third team, but he absolutely has been a valuable rotational player for the Patriots and Saints over his last 16 years now. He played a career low 33% of the snaps in New Orleans last season, but that was due to missing 3 games. He's been on the field for about half the plays, and produced pretty well, even though he never turned into the pass rusher that New England hoped he would become, when they made him the final pick of the first round in 2015, with 11.5 total sacks since then, racking up 1 tackle for loss per 90 snaps during his stint in New Orleans, and just holding his ground with heavy hands, as the Saints were near the top of the league in rushing yards allowed in each of the last 2 years. He presents a more sturdy presence for early down work at 320 pounds, and could officially be named the starter because of that, even though he may be limited to that. And then there's a rookie from USC, Jay Tufele, who opted out of this past season, but still was the first name off the board on day 3 of the draft. I would say he brings somewhat of a similar skill set as Brian, who we talked about in the beginning, as a free technique and an even front primarily, even though Brian had a little bit of a thicker build coming out, to where I could have seen him play as a base end in odd front. I wasn't quite as high on Tufele as some other people, as he ended up just outside my top 10 for defensive tackles in the draft, because he really struggled to anchor down against double teams, or even down blocks at times, when caught on a bad angle. Still, I understand the intrigue that he brings, and depending on usage, he could be a productive pro. I personally really like the way that he can crash through the inside shoulder of blockers and zone run plays, and the lateral agility to redirect against counter-type plays. Plus he has good length and ability to get around guards or go through them if he sees them set too softly in pass pro. Getting him up to speed with that rookie contract in mind might make the most sense here. I believe Brian will ultimately fend off the veteran and rookie, because Urban and his group want to see what they have in a still very toolsy player, who now is an excellent defensive line coach as the guy calling shots. However, if he can't deliver some splash plays for this group, and allows himself to get pushed out of his run fits where he's been undisciplined, I would think that we see more of Brown just setting them up for longer downs, and then bringing in Tufele to boost the pass rush. Moving back to the NFC and to the linebacker position, we'll look at the Los Angeles Rams and the inside linebackers. There's 3 teams in the NFL that have really stood out with their poor linebacker play and lack of talent at their position. The Eagles, to me, have actually done the most this offseason to fix that area, after not investing any resources into it leading up to it. And the Packers will once again have a tough time fitting the run, as well as matching up with running backs in the pass game, with very little additions to that group. The unit that I just don't know who will be out there week 1 is the Rams. The first 3 names on this list all played between 41 and 55% of the snaps for this LA defense last season, which finished first in yards and points allowed. Not saying that they were a big reason for doing so, since the star of the show, of course, is 3-time defensive player Aaron Donald and that versatile secondary. Micah Kaiser is your prototypical old-school Mike linebacker who can plug gaps, has pretty quick hands to disengage from blocks, and can definitely lay the wood when he gets a chance to. After barely playing on defense his rookie season and missing all of year 2 with surgery on his pec, LA made the decision to let Corey Littleton walk in free agency, who was one of the more underrated linebackers in the league until arriving in Vegas, although that might have been more about the lack of available cash. Last season, Kaiser played 100% of the snaps in 6 of the first 7 games, but then missed the final 7. He lacks that explosiveness to break on routes and cover guys comfortably in man, but he has trimmed down a bit and has not looked out of place in passing downs. Now he needs to improve his tackling efficiency, which at an 11.5% miss rate doesn't represent the type of player that I saw at Virginia. Troy Reader didn't play a single snap in 7 weeks, making his mark on special teams primarily, but then logged at least 90% of the snaps in each of the last 6 games, as Kaiser was out with a knee injury. And what was kinda odd to me is that Reader not only started both the Rams playoff games, but Kaiser didn't even play 1 snap on defense. Reader presents a thick, sturdy frame and does not mind banging into bigger bodies to stuff the run, leading to 5 tackles for loss last season. I think his limitations as a coverage defender may be a little more apparent with how heavy-footed he looks at times, but he can provide some pressure, indicated by 3 sacks on just 15 blitzes. Kenny Young was acquired from Baltimore in the Marcus Peters trade a couple of years ago, but was mostly limited to special teams work and some sub-packages early on. Last season, he cracked 70% of the snaps just once, and even then barely, but he's always had a role in passing downs, appearing in every single game. He's a little smaller than those 2 other guys, and not as adept on taking on blockers in his face, but he can cover more ground against the pass, and has some quality snaps in man coverage. He did allow 23 of 28 targets his way to be completed last season, but for just 187 yards and no touchdowns, while coming up with a long pick 6 against New England when he snuffed out a screen pass. And then we have Ernest Jones, one of the Rams' draft reaches, I would say, even though I don't think at the very end of the 3rd round is totally crazy. I just liked a few other linebackers better than they were still on the board. There is plenty to like with Jones' activity and the ability to step around trash, as well as his skills at changing directions in space, even though his coverage numbers didn't nearly match up to it last year at South Carolina. Still, I get why the Rams wanted to acquire a player like that, with plenty of room to still improve, to potentially become an actual 3-down player for them down the road, because among this group, I'm not totally sure if they have one of those guys. I still believe Kaiser will earn that starting gig in the middle again, but Reader should give him a run for his money, and at worst steal some time there, as well as being a nice backup that wouldn't present too much of a drop-off. And then I believe they like the rookie enough to start him at will, or however the new defensive coordinator Raheem Morris wants to call that spot, as a more rangy player. Young would be the primary backup for that job, as well as Cedarfield as a dime option on quite a few passing downs. Either way, I feel better about this group heading into 2020, but I don't love any of the pieces. Moving on to the secondary, we're looking at the Detroit Lions number 2 cornerback. Sure, the Lions did finally concede to a rebuild when trading away the longtime quarterback Matt Stafford, and the receiving corps is a major question mark for them, but the offensive line has a chance to be great sooner rather than later, and I talked about the young emerging superstar running back DeAndre Swift 2 weeks ago in my breakdown of the biggest breakout candidates for 2021. Once again, link for that is down below in the description. However, I believe with some receiving talent, and them at least having a serviceable quarterback play from Jared Goff until they identify a franchise signal call these next couple of years. So to me the bigger challenge even will be to pick up the corpses of this Matt Patricia regime with all the defensive players that he brought in to fit his scheme and the damage that he has left without really any proven players other than maybe Romeo Okwara and Jamie Collins. New defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn will have a lot of work to do, and while I do like the way that they have boosted the interior defensive line, there are plenty of questions about the back 7. They had some of the worst cornerback play in the league in 2020, and not only last year's third overall pick Jeffrey Okudah to bounce back in tremendous fashion after a rough debut campaign. I still believe in the talent, but I'm now very interested to see who will line up on the opposite side of him. Last season that was Amani Oruwariye, who I actually liked a lot coming out of Penn State a couple of years ago, and called a steal back then already, when he lasted all the way until the 5th round. I thought some teams may look at him having some scheme limitations due to his tall build and some of the uncomfort redirecting from off alignment, but I certainly liked his ability to challenge receivers at the line if he acquired more technical nuance, and carry routes vertically, also in free deep coverages. I would say he had an up and down 2020 season, reaching 11th in completion percentage allowed, but 102nd out of 103 eligible corners in yards per reception. With Glenn's background in the man-heavy system in New Orleans, I believe that he will like what this guy brings coming into year 3, but if he wants to establish himself as a starter, he will finally have to be a more reliable tackler, which was also my biggest issue with him coming out of college, missing 18.5% of his attempts in 2020. The Lions also brought in Quinton Dunbar in free agency, who 2 years ago in Washington was one of the higher graded corners in multiple statistical areas, but only played in 6 games for the Seahawks last year, and not nearly at the same level. He seemed to be a great fit for that Seattle system after forcing Washington to trade him due to their unwillingness to commit to him financially, having lived off UDFA and bottom of the roster type of money, thanks to good size, ball skills and speed to stay in the hip pocket of receivers, even though we would ultimately see more diversity from the Seattle defense. But now in Detroit, if Glenn wants to stay with more matchup-oriented coverage approach, we could see plenty of single high safety structures, which would work well for Dunbar, but health has been a major factor throughout his career, and he will have to prove himself once again. And then I look at this year's late 3rd round pick Ifeatu Melifonwu, and kind of a similar light as Amani Oruwariye, even though he did finally go off the board just as we started the 100s. He seemed like a clear D2 pick, who could easily have gone at the end of the 2nd round rather than the 3rd. While I actually thought Oruwariye had more juice in general out of his breaks, I believe Melifonwu might even have better physical tools. Watching him line up against North Carolina's De'Ami Brown, you really saw that ability to not allow separation down the sideline or the post. He wasn't actually asked to play a lot of press and then stay in man in Syracuse's cover 3 heavy approach, but he has the length and physicality to really develop in that area. I also love the way that he fights his way off blocks and gets involved as a tackler. His ability to play off and not get lost is the most concerning of the 3 guys here actually, but I think he has a lot of potential in the right system. So in the end, I believe Oruwariye will remain the starter on the outside, while Dunbar could easily challenge for the starting nickel spot, which I highlighted as Detroit's biggest remaining need about a month ago, as they have very little there. Melifonwu does still have a long way to go with his press technique, and one thanks to his athleticism in college a lot, before it did seem to have a tough time sticking with receivers during Senior Bowl week, when he was actually asked to jam them at the line, so it may take until late in the year for him to get some time. Switching conferences once more, now let's look at the Tennessee Titans options to fill up nickelback and strong safety. This is going to pretty much a full overhaul of the Titans secondary, having lost their 3 starting corners and one of their safeties. Pro Bowler Kevin Byard is sort of the last man standing, as we will see how quickly 1st round pick Caleb Farley will adapt to basically being the number 1 corner from week 1 on, and how they put this group together in general. Veteran Janoris Jenkins should start on the outside alongside Farley, and you have Byard as a rangy center fielder when they do run single high coverages, as well as playing down low a lot more than people think. But I believe the nickelback and strong safety spot, for that matter, if you want to call it that way, are up for grabs, and there's 3 candidates to fill them. Amani Hooker was a 4th round pick for Tennessee back in 2019. While he didn't start any games as a rookie, particularly in special teams, this past season he was the primary backup to Kenny Vaccaro, playing almost every single snap in the 3 games that the starter was inactive for. The interesting thing was, when Hooker was in the lineup, the Titans seemed to use Byard a lot more close to the line of scrimmage, and he put the second-year man deep, who I thought of more as a nickel and 2-high guy. There's a little bit of stiffness, and I don't think he has the range to play too much single high coverages, but he does show good feel for route patterns and anticipatory skills, while not shying away from sticking his nose in there as a run defender in the box. Looking at the numbers, while he wasn't responsible for huge plays, he did allow 19 of 23 passes his way to be completed, giving up 10 yards per target. The Titans clearly seem to like him, however, as they made the decision to let Vaccaro go before making any other moves this offseason. Dane Cruikshank has been a special teams ace for this team ever since he was drafted back in 2018. He logged 366 snaps on various kicking and return teams in 2019, before missing all but 2 games last year. Whether that's catching wide open passes for touchdowns and pump fakes, blocking field goals, or just covering kicks, he has contributed for this team without much notice. But he has only played 58 snaps on defense over the course of his career, and the defensive tape on him is just limited. Although he did pick off a pass in the end zone on the last play before halftime against the Steelers this last year, and that was his only snap on defense all season long. And then we have rookie Elijah Molden, who I thought was the best nickel, as well as my number 4 safety in the draft. He almost exclusively played in the slot in 2019, but then was used as a deep safety much more in a COVID-shortened junior season. I absolutely adore the ferocity that he plays the game with, very reminiscent of another undersized DB coming out of Washington a few years ago, and now All-Pro Cardinals safety Buda Baker. Molden may not be the most sound at reading the hips of receivers in man coverage, but he has the reactionary explosiveness to get back into the hip pocket of receivers after initially allowing some separation, and he's very physical with guys coming into his area and zone. Playing from depth, he does provide pretty good range for split safety stuff, while having the burst to quickly close down as a robber or bust defender. I think wherever they line him up, he will make an impact as an edge setter and blitzer for that unit. So I definitely like at least 2 of the options Tennessee has here, with Cruikshank to me being best served to continue making his impact in the other third of the game. I would probably think Hooker, having experienced in deep coverage more so, especially as a pro of course, and Molden's aggressive style of play may be better suited for the nickel, would make the most sense in 2021, but I could see Mike Vrabel and company quickly fall in love with all the different things that the rookie brings to the table, and therefore want to utilize him that way as well. And the final position that we're going to analyze today is the Las Vegas Raiders, the boundary safety for them. If there's one position group that I believe could have the biggest turnaround league-wide, it's the Raiders safeties. Sure, the Chiefs completely overhauled the offensive line, both New York teams among others brought in playmakers to the receiving corps, and I love how the Browns attacked the back 7 of the defense. However, just looking at how atrocious the group of safety was in Vegas last season, I could see them making a major jump. And to be able to properly understand what I think we'll see from Gus Bradley's new defensive scheme in terms of usage of the position and coverage patterns, I highly encourage you to check out my piece on the most improved position groups in the NFL this offseason. A link to that will be down below in the description. But in short, I think we'll see a lot more split safety looks, where Bradley needs guys that he can sort of use in interchangeable fashion and play with the mental fortitude to change responsibilities late, as he splits the field into the side from the hash the ball is spotted on and the wide half, so to speak. Carl Joseph is returning to the Black Hole, or rather Death Star, or whatever they call the new stadium now, after a 1-year stint in Cleveland. He was a mid-first round pick for the Raiders back in 2016. He did show improvement throughout his 4 years in Oakland, but wasn't packed when he moved to Vegas, which led to him joining the Browns and playing his best season yet, I thought. The stats were just okay, but I really liked the way that he rotated down and filled against the run, playing in between routes and 2 shells, and the force that he brought as a tackler. He came up with a huge interception in the Browns' wildcard game against the Chiefs, even though they ultimately couldn't finish the job. Now somewhat surprisingly returning to the Raiders, I think he brings that football IQ to read route patterns from depth or drop down low, and be a physical player for them. Jonathan Abram was supposed to be the replacement for Joseph, and his second season was highly anticipated after missing all but 1 game of his rookie year. But unfortunately, he was among the worst starting safeties in the entire league. I rarely try to base an opinion purely based on a grade from Pro Football Focus, because I disagree a lot with the way that they score things and stuff like that, but that number 35.9 might be the lowest that I've ever seen them hand out. Abram is a seeking missile, and he has come up with a few key stops, but he has also missed quite a bit, and he's had several bad mental errors that have cost his team. That last touchdown in the second Chiefs game to a wide open Travis Kelce will never leave my mind, where he's responsible for the deep half for quarter and just leaves the star tight end by himself as he tries to come up on a scrambling Patrick Mahomes, who's just waiting for somebody to mess up. Abram is too aggressive to play the high post, and his eyes get caught in the backfield on too many occasions. This is a young player that Mike Mayock and John Gruden still want to see succeed, but if Bradley isn't sure about his ability to grasp the defense or execute his job properly, I could see him being relegated to some matchup against tight ends and dime linebacker work. And for our final time, we'll end with a rookie, and there were 3 to choose from here, since I definitely believe the early second round pick Trevon Merrick will start as a field side safety, which is what he played and excelled at for TCU, and Virginia Tech's Divine Diablo is more so what I just described Abram could be for Vegas, with how deep that room is now all of a sudden. Tyree Gillespie was one of my favorite safeties in the draft, because while he was primarily used as a single high free safety at Missouri, he offers a skill set to have a more diversified role. Obviously, he's highly capable of being a center fielder, with good range and discipline, but he also runs the alley with conviction, has some high quality man coverage reps against Florida star tight end Kyle Pitts on tape, and is an outstanding open field tackler overall. The big issue with him is that he shockingly never had a single interception in college, and he has to become more of a decisive playmaker, but I definitely think he brings some impressive smarts and football character to get that coaching staff to buy in. I would think we get a lot of free safety looks from Vegas, and even 4 of them in dime packages, but in terms of the true starter into the boundary, Joseph to me should be the easiest guy to plug in, while Gillespie would be a tremendous backup at both spots, and Abram maybe has to use his psychopath attitude in special teams and in the boxes and packages to get the people there to buy into him again. As I mentioned in the beginning, a couple of other position battles that I have my eye on, with the Chicago Bears quarterback position obviously, with Andy Dalton being brought in as a free agent and them announcing him as the QB1, but then using the opportunity when Justin Fields fell and smartly trading up for him. You have the Philadelphia Eagles, pretty much the full running back depth chart, with Miles Sanders coming into year 3, him looking to finally break out and be a more consistent player. Kerryon Johnson being brought in from Detroit. You have Boston Scott still there, who is more of your lower tier RB2, probably better as a third option. And then they got a steal in the draft in Kenneth Gainwell from Memphis, who might have the highest potential of this entire group. Kansas City Chiefs with the ex-receiver, now that Sammy Watkins is gone, with DeMarcus Robinson and Byron Pringle as the veterans there still, as well as Cornell Powell, the 5th round pick, is somebody who I really like and I think will fit really well in that role. Cincinnati Bengals, the tight end position, which has had its moments, but no consistent production in recent years, with a former 2nd round pick in Drew Sample, CJ Osoma, who's been pretty productive as a receiver when available, and Thaddeus Moss, who was a UDFA last year, but has the connection already with Joe Burrow, going back to the day at LSU, and he already vied for his number 1 receiver from that time, who they drafted with the 5th overall pick, so maybe he gets his tight end on the field as well. Then a couple of guard situations with the Detroit Lions on the right side, with second-year man Logan Stenberg, one of the big free agency additions Holopoli Vaitai, who they hope to start at right tackle, but hasn't really worked out and now they replaced him, maybe they're looking to move him inside, and Terrell Crosby, who I liked as a tackle prospect from Oregon. While on the Baltimore Ravens, it's more the left side, with Ben Powers, Ben Bredesen, and Ben Cleveland, the 3 Bens I like to call them, who were all mid-round picks and have kind of their weaknesses, but all very physical players, so either way they're going to have some depth at that position. And defensively, with the Minnesota Vikings, the right defensive end spot, where they bring back Stephen Weatherly, who was a long-term veteran for them and spent 1 year in Carolina before coming back now. DJ Warren was a mid-round pick for them last year, and actually is the returning sack man with about 3 sacks or so. Not a very productive unit. Jalen Holmes also being part of the rotation, and a bunch of rookies with Janaris Robinson from Florida State and Patrick Jones from Pittsburgh. A lot of potential there, but just not really sure who's ready to step up. Seattle Seahawks 3 technique, where they have Al Woods, who's more of your natural 1 technique, and then a couple of guys who are actually defensive ends listed. Rasheem Green, who has been fairly productive for them the last few years, was kind of that 5 or 4 technique at USC, and I could see half the body type to transition to the inside as a 3 technique, big gap penetrator. And LG Collier, the 1st round pick from 2 years ago, who I already mentioned earlier, I kind of look in the same way. The Philadelphia Eagles Sam linebacker, where they have a bunch of different options. Injanad Avery, more of your +1 on the line, edge rusher type of guy. Alex Singleton, who played some quality snaps for them last year, is a fan favorite. Davion Taylor, a mid-round pick for them last year as well. Played a lot between the offensive tackle and the slot receiver at Colorado, so more of your type of overhang defender. And kind of in a similar fashion, Jacoby Stevens, who was like a 7th round pick for them out of LSU, actually listed as a safety, had some crazy testing, but never really did anything in deep coverage and was even more so used as a blitzer and in the box for the Tigers. Then you have the New Orleans Saints, the number 2 cornerback, with veterans Patrick Robinson and PJ Williams, who have both played pretty well for the Saints overall, but never really established themselves on the outside. And Paulson Adebo, the 3rd round pick from Stanford, who had some crazy ball production in 2018 and 19, and has kind of been lost in his pre-draft process, but I still really like. I think the Chicago Bears and the LA Rams, I'm not totally sure what they'll do at nickelback, with the Bears investing a lot of mid-round picks with Duke Shelley, Kindle Wildor, and now Thomas Graham Jr. into that position, while the Rams in the middle rounds last year got Terrell Burgess, who was an intriguing safety and slot corner prospect out of Utah last year, David Long, a UDFA, and Robert Rochelle, one of the mid-round picks this year. And then finally the Arizona Cardinals with the free safety situation, so the guy starting alongside Budda Baker, with the 2 Thompsons, Jalen Thompson, who was a supplemental draft pick a couple of years ago and has played quality snaps for them, Deontay Thompson from Alabama, formerly Charles Washington, who they now brought back for a 3rd straight time as more of a depth piece maybe, but they seem to like him to have him on the roster, special teams. And then finally James Wiggins, who was a late round pick for them this year. Must have been some injury concerns for him to go this late, because I thought he really presented an intriguing skill set, maybe not so much as a single high free safety, but having great athleticism and being able to do a lot of different things. But that's gonna do it. I think we've talked enough now. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, share it with a couple of friends who want to get excited for the NFL season again, and are looking to catch up with some of the stuff that is going on around the league. As I already mentioned, the link to my page is down below in the description, where you find all my write-ups as well as these YouTube videos. Most recently, that in-depth 2-part series on some of the biggest breakout candidates for this upcoming season, as well as my social media handles if you want to just see when I post something or want to get in touch with me. I will probably be back next week, not totally sure with what, as I'm thinking about doing what I did a year ago, looking at some of the players in the make-or-break years, or that I believe are just under the most pressure. I might actually take a week off, however, since I'm actually on holiday at the moment that I'm recording this. But at worst, I'll be back in 2 weeks, already starting my preseason content, so to speak, with my version of the NFL Top 100, Power Rankings, and my Fantasy Diamond segment, which we had some huge hits last year, like having Antonio Gibson, Stephon Diggs, and the Bucs defense way higher than the consensus rankings. So I got a lot of stuff in the works, and I hope to be able to share with everybody listening right now, as well as broaden the base of viewers, which you guys are a key factor for, if you just let other people know where to find my work. So, until then, see you later. Peace!